Can I just tell you how glad I am to be here tonight and how much I admire you? I mean, here we are, it's a Wednesday night, and you've come to be part of this, what my grandmother used to call the prayer meeting on Wednesday nights. I rather like that. I didn't realize, hadn't thought about it till Adam just said it, that, that I'm your first speaker. So it's going to be up from here, it's going to get better and better. I love your theme. I love thinking about characters of the Bible. If you listen to this lesson tonight, and of course we're going to start in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 1, you need to be able to see a Bible. But if you listen to this lesson, what's going to happen is that by the end of this, if you don't already have a walking down the street kind of working knowledge of the book of Nehemiah, you will. But it's not just that. What you will do, I believe, with me is just really learn to love this man called Nehemiah. He's pretty special, and excuse me, you draw from him some terrific lessons about leadership, which are applicable to elders in the church, applicable to a man in business who's a Christian, applicable to parents in the home, applicable to a man as he governs his family. These are basic but important principles of leadership. And as we go through the story, the account of Nehemiah, I'm going to draw those leadership qualities out. They are on the board right now. This is the outline of the sermon. So if you're keeping notes, it'll be easy. These are the points. So let me give you a segue into this by reminding you of some Israelite history. The Old Testament is about Jesus Christ. Now you must appreciate that to begin with. The Old Testament is the chronicles of the Israelite nation. Why would God pay such attention to a little nation like Israel? Why would He see fit to protect them like He did? Ups and downs and faithfulness and unfaithfulness and fickleness and so many different turns in the road. And the answer is because by prophecy, it would be through this nation that the Messiah would come. And besides that, Galatians chapter 3 says the Old Testament law was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. You are my friend. Thank you. All right, so you remember the kings. God didn't want kings. God wanted prophets. We ought to be careful what we pray for. And the Israelite people want to be like the nations around them. And so they start begging for a king. God says, you're not going to like it. I'm telling you, you're not going to like it. And He made them repent of it because it was just wrong. It was a gift, but He gave it to them. He allowed them to have it. I think to teach them a lesson. So you have the major kings. You have Saul, and then David, and then his son Solomon, and Solomon's son Rehoboam, who was a very foolish man and split the kingdom. This is going to be the beginning of the end for a lot of Israel. Now Israel, the northern kingdom took the name Israel, essentially 10 tribes. The southern kingdom took the name Judah, essentially 2 tribes. And that's kind of interesting. Judah was faithful longer than Israel, but Israel was much larger. Today, I fear we're not so very different. I had a conversation not long ago with a professor at one of our universities who said to me that it was sad to him that the most talented boys, and I'm sure this is, it's opinionated, but he said our most talented boys go to the left. He said the reason is that the churches are so much larger, and there's fame to be had and that sort of thing, and they're drawn to that. Well, the northern kingdom was larger than the southern kingdom. And you have this succession of unrighteous kings, and you have lots of idolatry, and finally God gives them up. About 742 BC, God said, I've had enough of this, and I'm giving you over to Assyrian captivity. Now what happens then is that essentially the northern kingdom just dissipates. But the southern kingdom remained faithful longer. And you have 130 years or so before the southern kingdom goes into Babylonian captivity. Now they're going to follow the same path ultimately, and they're going to be idolatrous, and so they go into Babylonian captivity. Now we're almost to Nehemiah. So 50 years pass, and the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians, Cyrus, 50 years later. Well, the Persians don't have any angst against the Jews. They're not their enemies, and so ask the question, would you want to go back? Would you like to go back and repopulate your homeland? You want to go back and rebuild it's okay with us if you want to do it. So under Zerubbabel, about 42,000 of them go back. Not everybody. A lot of them stay in in Persia, but a bunch of them go on back to Jerusalem. And under Zerubbabel, and you have the prophecies of Zechariah and Haggai, they start rebuilding. And they build the temple. It takes about 4.5 years. They rebuild the temple, and they build some houses around. But what they didn't do was build a wall. The book of Nehemiah is about the building of the wall. You got lots of talk today about building walls, borders. I'm going to tell you something right now. God is serious about building walls. He's serious about it. I mean, the book of Nehemiah is about this subject. Why do you reckon that it was so important that the Jews had a wall around Jerusalem? The answer is that same reason why tonight before you came to prayer meeting, you probably locked the door on your house, didn't you? I did. You got to lock the door. Why do you do that? Because there's a difference between a trespasser and a guest. And that door, that locked door, is what gives you that prerogative between those two. There's a difference between stealing and benevolence. The difference is those walls, that door. When you talk about the Jews there in Jerusalem, I'm telling you that they were just subject to raids of some very bad people for a long time through there because they had no walls. So, 140 years after they come back, you have 50 years. Well, let me get it straight now. You have the destruction of Jerusalem, and then 50 years later, the Jews are able to go back under the Persians, and they can rebuild, and they rebuild the temple. And so 90 years later, you have Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king, Artaxerxes. That's kind of an interesting job. Now, he's paid for it. I expect he's paid pretty well, but he's still just a servant. Nobody looks to the cupbearer and says, wow, you're a great leader. But beating in his chest is the heart of a great leader. He just doesn't know it yet. I've been exposed to some great gospel preachers who are now dead, and I have wonderful memories of being around some of these men and being able to talk with them as a young preacher and asking them questions. It always was interesting. I've been studying recently about N.B. Hardeman, and you recognize that name, Nicholas Brody Hardeman. And it occurs to me that he was in high school at some point, and there were days that the roll was called, and I don't know if they called him Brody, if they called him NB, I don't know, but the teacher would call his name, and he would say, here. And, there just wasn't a lot of importance attached to that name. But I'm telling you one thing, the day would come when he was very important. He's still important, and he's been gone a long, long time. How many gospel preachers in their youth have cut their teeth on the Hardeman Tabernacle sermons? How important his work was. Nehemiah is a cupbearer. I mean, he's about to step right into greatness. You think that leaders are born or are they made? I don't think he was born this way, but he had some qualities about him that you got to admire. So he's working in Shushan the palace, and his brother comes in and says, I've been to Jerusalem. Well, Nehemiah is fascinated by that, and he's got some other Jews with him. And Nehemiah says, so, how are things going in Jerusalem? And how is it with the people who have gone back who survived the captivity and all, and now they've come back to Jerusalem to rebuild it? And how is it? And there's kind of a joy about it, I think. He's excited to hear this news because he anticipates that it's going to be good news. Well, it wasn't. It was bad news. And the walls are still laying on the ground, and the gates are still burned with fire. I mean, it's just like it was 140 years ago. It's like it was. And Nehemiah knows that what this means is that the people of God are not faithful to God. They haven't. It just means so much they aren't where they ought to be. And he's just struck by it. And so for several days, he just grieves. He grieves and he weeps. And then he begins to pray. Now, the first thing that I want you to see about a great leader, quality of a great leader, is that he sees himself as a servant. Through the book of Nehemiah, this is never going to change. Nehemiah will always see himself as a servant. This is not about arrogance. It's not about, it didn't just hear this problem in Jerusalem and say, wow, this is a great opportunity for me, because he's no opportunist. He's just a man of God, and he loves his people, and he loves the service to God, and he realizes that this is just wrong. Where those people are in Jerusalem right now is just wrong. It's very much like David when he came upon Goliath, and he heard Goliath's speech, Goliath of Gath, and he just couldn't believe it. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now, there's no arrogance in that. It isn't that David is opportunist in saying, look, I could be a great leader and I could one day be king and this is my door. There's nothing of that. There's none of that. David is just a man with the right kind of heart. And I'm telling you that the moment was there that somebody needed to stand up and say, on his hind legs, and to say, here's what is right and we're not doing it. That's Nehemiah. All right, so the first quality I want you to get is this one, is that a great leader is one who sees himself as a servant. You think that's true about elders in the church? Look, you get to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, and if a man desires the office of a bishop, he's desired a good work. A man needs to desire it. If a man doesn't desire it, you better be careful about that. You don't want to twist a man's arm too hard. He needs to desire it, but not because of arrogance, not because of pride. You get to 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 3, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but examples to the flock. You hear that? In other words, he's not coming into the eldership in order to subjugate people. He's not coming in order to say, I want you to see how powerful I am. He's an example to the flock. He is a servant in the flock. All right, now here's the prayer. So this is going to be the second lesson, but one of the most beautiful prayers of Scripture. You want to learn how to pray? Go to the Old Testament and read the prayers. This is Nehemiah. So he's all shook up, been crying, weeping for some days here, grieving over Israel. I'm in chapter 1, verse 4. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We've acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants. You're talking about the people in Jerusalem. They're your servants, your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power, your strong hand. Oh Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. I love the last line. For I was the king's cupbearer. There's a humility in that. You got to love this guy. It's a passion for what's right. And he prays this prayer, and as he's praying it, just ripens inside of got to do this. Somebody's got to go back to Jerusalem and fix this and rebuild those walls. I just need to do it. I need to go do this. Now, it's not an easy thing to come into the king. He's the cupbearer. You might think this. It's kind of like Esther. Esther going before her husband, and she's the queen, and Ahasuerus, and to say, I need to ask you a favor. She was afraid that he might kill her. Now, why do you suppose that's true? And here you have Nehemiah nervous around Artaxerxes, interrupting him with the sadness. Should I come before him with this sadness that I'm feeling? But what will he do? Now, I think the reason must be this. I read one day about one of our recent presidents, and maybe this is true about all of them, I don't know, but he doesn't choose his own ties. He didn't. He's not president now. And everyone wanted to get up and put a tie on it, but he didn't pick his own ties. And the reason was, according to the article, it wasn't that he didn't like to choose his own ties, it's that he shouldn't be distracted by trivia. This man's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. He's got so much to think about and doing the right thing, and he doesn't need to be distracted, and so somebody would just hand him a tie, and he would put it on. I suppose it might be that way with these foreign heathen kings, too. You don't need a cupbearer who comes in and is all depressed. You don't want to interrupt your thought processes to look at him and say, so what's wrong? What's going on here? But that's what Nehemiah did. He took the risk and he showed his feelings, and the king was favorable toward him. And he began to ask him questions. And here's the description that Nehemiah gives of Jerusalem. He says, "This is a place of my father's tombs." I love that. You know, you could tell something about a culture of people by how they treat their dead. Now, I love to live in the South. You know what we do when you have a hearse and some cars drive by? Do you know what we do? And I hope we never change that. We shouldn't change that. We ought to have a respect for the dead. And Nehemiah, I suppose he grew up in as a slave. I think he grew up in captivity. But he's got such a reverence for the fact that his fathers are buried there. Anyway, the king says, how much time would you like? And what do you need from me? And so they have this conversation, and Nehemiah tells him all that. I need provisions. I need an entourage to protect me. I need this much time. And I think it takes 2, maybe 3 months to make the trip to Jerusalem. It's not going to be easy. But the king gives him everything he wants. And that brings us to point number 3. So, great leaders expect opposition. They expect it. So, we're in chapter 2 now. And as they're going along, they've got, Nehemiah has papers from the king to say, this is all good. He's doing this with my endorsement. But it gets to chapter 2 and verse 10, when Sanballat the Hornite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. Okay, let me tell you something now. It is not sensical for a man to be a leader of people and not expect opposition. I expect it's a whole lot easier to become a leader than to maintain as a leader, because there are going to be some hard days. I served as an elder in the West Huntsville church for a decade. Then I went back to being the preacher, and I'm happy as can be. Sometimes people would ask me, is it hard to be an elder? The answer is that most days it's not. Most days it's just a joy. But there are some days that it will chew your legs off. There are some days that are very, very hard. A man who expects no opposition is a foolish man. He doesn't need to be leading. He doesn't know what's in front of him. Nehemiah expected this. He was looking for it. As a matter of fact, as the walls are being constructed, he's not going to have a time that he does not have opposition. It's going to be a hard go. It's going to be an arduous build because of the opposition, Sanballat and Tobiah. And you ought to remember those names because I'm going to reference them toward the end of this lesson. A great leader anticipates opposition. Now here's the fourth one. And this brings us now to verse 11 of chapter 2. So he gets there. He gets to Jerusalem. And you might think that what he does just is to launch right into a discussion with the officials and to say, I've come with the power and endorsement of God and of Artaxerxes the king, the Persian king, and I've come to rebuild the walls, and you're going to follow me. I'm going to delegate responsibilities to you, and you're going to follow my lead. That's not what he did. It's pretty interesting. He gets to town, and he doesn't tell anybody who he is. But at night, he gets up and he starts going around the wall. And beginning in verse 11 of chapter 2, you have a rather detailed description of each place that he went to. I've been to Jerusalem, and I think this is fascinating. He goes around and looks at every part. Now, why do you suppose a man would do that? And it's this. You wouldn't, as a leader, delegate to other people what they're to do unless you know your stuff, unless you know what you're talking about. He's not coming in there half-cocked. He's going to learn and be able to speak from knowledge. I know what I see. I know what's here, and I'm ready to do this. It reminds me of the third generation curse. You know the third generation curse? It's fascinating philosophy, and I expect it holds true a lot of the time. Here's a man who has an idea for a business, and he starts to build it, and over years, maybe a great deal of his life. Why? He has blood, sweat, and tears in that business. And he brings it up, and by the time he's an old man, it's a successful business, very lucrative business. And he's given most of his life to it. And that second generation watched him. That son watched him do that work, and he has an understanding of what goes into making that thing work. And so he'll probably be successful too. But the third generation didn't watch it come up. The third generation has never known anything except a large and lucrative business. And that third generation is going to grow up with a silver spoon in his mouth, and the third generation loses it. That'll be the generation that will lose the business because he doesn't know where it came from. Now, that's not always true. And sometimes you'll hear of a very powerful man, owner of some great big business, corporation, and he will have his children, he'll have his children working in the mailroom. He'll put them down at the bottom. I don't know, it may be hard for other workers to see them and say, who are you? I'm the boss's son. Come on, why are you down here? You got all sorts of money. So they miss the point. The point is that you got to know what you're talking about, or men are not going to follow you. That's the nature of a leader. He's got to know. And Nehemiah teaches us that when he comes into Jerusalem. Now, here's the next one. He makes excellence a personal matter. Now, when you get to chapter 3, you're going to have just a discussion of who he assigns to each part. He's got 40 different work teams building 42 sections of the wall, and they will all join together. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now, this is not true in every case, but in a number of the cases, and I'm going to read a couple of them to you just to illustrate the point. He would have people building the wall right next to where their house was. Now, it might be a derelict place. It might be where they don't like to live because it's fearful, or it might be where they're going to live. But I can tell you this, when he could, he tried to have them build the wall right where their house was. Now, how do you reckon that? Why do you suppose he would do that? Well, of course, I think it's intuitive. I think it makes perfectly good sense. He didn't want people building wall that'll fall down. He wanted people doing their best, putting their back into he wanted them to practice excellence. And if the man knows that my wife and children are going to be protected from enemies by the wall that I'm building, I'm going to put my best into it. I want this to stand, right? Walmart's smart. Walmart's got this figured out. Walmart's the biggest corporation of its kind in the world. Now, I don't know, there are a lot of secrets to that, I suppose, but one is that if you work for Walmart, what I'm told is that part of your pay is stock in the company. You work there and you get a little bit of the stock. Now, why do you suppose that's smart? Well, it's because how I treat that customer has something to do with my future. I want that customer to come back again. The better the business, the better opportunity I have for a future, because I own part of this business. Nehemiah made excellence a personal matter. Now here's number 6. We'll talk about great leadership. A great leader gets his hands dirty. There are a couple of ways this is true with reference to Nehemiah. I want to refer you back to elders in the church. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 3, he says, now, not as being lords over God's heritage. You take a man who wants to be an elder, but in his heart what he's thinking is, I'm going to have some power. He really doesn't, you know. No single elder has any power. Every elder is subject to the elders. Everyone is. But he may feel like that. He may feel like that's a position of honor, and now I'll be elevated and won't I be something? And I tell you, a man like that's going to hurt the church. He's dangerous to the work. Now watch how Peter writes it. Neither is being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. Nehemiah does this in 2 ways. And the first one is that Nehemiah is working on the wall too. So he's beside all these people that are subject to him, but he's sweating right beside them. He's laying those blocks, those stones. He's hauling those timbers. Anyway, look at it with me. I want to read chapter 4, verse 21. Chapter 4, verse 21. So we labored in the work, and half the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. At the same time, I also said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, so they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off for washing. I just want you to be impressed with the fact that he's saying, I'm working right beside them. There's no difference between us. I'm leading them, that's true, but but I'm sweating right beside him. I have an idea that the workers loved this man. I mean, he was a leader. He was every bit a leader, but he got his hands dirty too. There's a lesson there, but that's not all. There's one more. Look at chapter 5 now and verse 6. There was a problem because, of all things, while they're rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and the houses there, you also have a famine going on. There was a shortage of food. Now, the way that it was addressed is that you had some wealthy Jews and some poor Jews. And the wealthy Jews started loaning money at interest to the poor ones. And sometimes, it would be, well, what do you have to sell? And the poor one would say, well, I have a small plot of land. Well, I'll buy your land from you. But when they do that and then the money runs out, the proceeds of the sale of the land, what happens when the money's gone? And the answer is that they would sell themselves as a slave to their fellow Jews. And when that money ran out, they would sell their wives and their children as slaves in order to not starve to death. And their fellow Jews were the ones who were buying them. Now, if that doesn't shake you up, I mean, here they are as a people in a process of rebuilding Jerusalem for the glory of God, and they're doing this. And I'm telling you, I think they're on the verge of some sort of revolt when it comes to the ears of Nehemiah. Something bad's about to happen here, and this whole thing could come unraveled. So Nehemiah gets wind of this. He understands what's going on. And here's how he addresses it. I'm in chapter 5, verse 6. And I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. After serious thought, and by the way, have you picked up on the fact that Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, is a diary? I mean, it's Nehemiah writing down what happened step by step. After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, each of you is exacting usury, that's interest, from his brother. So I called a great assembly against them, and I said to them, according to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations, slavery to other nations. Now indeed, will you even sell your brethren, or should they be sold to us? Then they were silenced and found nothing to say. They were ashamed. Then I said, what you're doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? Now look at verse 10. I've got it underlined in my Bible. I also, with my brethren and my servants, am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. All right, I'm telling you now, he's sweating beside of them. He's got blisters on his hands just like they do, building the wall. He's got a section to build too. And when it came to the problem inside the camp with the poor people, he's among them loaning them money. He's giving them grain to help them survive. Verse 11, restore now to them even this day their lands, their vineyards, their olive groves, their houses, also 100th of the money and the grain, the new wine, the oil that you have charged them. So they said, they were tucking their tails, we will restore it and will require nothing from them. We will do as you say. Then I called the priests and required an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. He didn't just say, I think you should stop what you're doing and give their land back. He said, you need to stop what you're doing and give their land back because I and others are loaning them money, or giving them money, giving them grain in order to keep them afloat while you're doing this. And aren't we one people? And don't we have a cause bigger than this? It's not about business. It's about doing the will of God. Nehemiah got his hands dirty. Nehemiah was a leader who was right in there with them doing the right thing. All right, now here's the last one. A great leader always leads by godly core values. See, a great leader is distinguished by the fact that he never ever compromises on this until he breathes his last and closes his eyes for the last time. He's governed by a set of principles and values, core values, that are about doing the right thing and about treating people as you should and about serving God to the best of your ability. And he's not going to veer from that. Nehemiah doesn't veer from it. This cupbearer servant is now a mighty leader. All right, now watch. So we get to chapter 7, and what he does is to repopulate Jerusalem. And I think this is fascinating. He goes back to the genealogical records, and he finds who it was living today whose people are directly connected to the ones who first came over 140 years ago. Now, why do you suppose he would do that? Well, I guess it's because he thinks that they're going to understand best, maybe through the stories that one generation would tell the next. They would understand best about what it was like to be in Babylonian captivity and what it is like now to have a place and to be rebuilding. The values would be there. So he repopulates it. Not all the Jews can live inside the walls of Jerusalem. So about a tenth of them, about 4,200 of them, are going to live inside these walls. The rest will live nearby. And he gets people who he believes will best understand it. Now that's chapter 7. In chapter 8, he has Ezra come and stand on a pulpit where everybody can see him, and he fills them up with the Word of God. It doesn't matter that they would have a beautiful wall and that they would be a nation of people that other nations would look at and say, wow, aren't these Jews great people? It won't matter if they don't please God. That's true about you and me. It doesn't matter. I'm telling you what, when you get ready to close your eyes for the last time, it will not matter how much money you made or how successful your business was. And I'm not opposed to people having money, but I tell you this, we'd better serve God. There will be nothing close to that. That's it. In chapter 9, he does a remarkable thing. So he creates a type of contract. I like this. He created a contract before God, and it rehearses the history of Israel and when God blessed them and when God didn't bless them because of their behavior. And he says, now, this is the vow we're making before God. And the people signed it. They put their seal on this. How do you like that? Why? It's because he wants the people to hold on to these core values. You've got to hold on to it. Now, that gives me 5 minutes, and that's just what I need. He wants them to hold on to core values. What are your core values? Are they driven by Jesus Christ? Do you have the values that Jesus has? By the way, 1 John chapter 1 would call that walking in the light. We walk according to the teachings and values of the New Testament. And that's how he was. Now, let's go to the end of the book. Here's chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah finishes the walls, and he gets the houses stabilized, populated, holding on to God's will, and then he goes back to finish his work or continue his work with the king, Artaxerxes. That's a long way home. He gets everything secured, though. Got a high priest there in Jerusalem. Everything looks really good to him. The problem is that a high priest, Elisha, is not a good man. Nehemiah didn't know that. He put him, here he is, governing the people. And before long, what Elisha, the high priest, does is to create a room, sort of a headquarters for Tobiah. Now remember where we started in this at the very beginning. Sanballat and Tobiah, they're enemies of God's people. They hated the fact that somebody was going to come of the Jews and rebuild Jerusalem, couldn't stand it. Well, now Tobiah, he's no different, but now the high priest, now that Nehemiah has gone back, the high priest places Tobiah in a place of honor there at the temple. And it starts having an influence. And so you have people in Israel who are ignoring, lots of them, they're ignoring, profaning the Sabbath day. Some of them are marrying the heathen people, and they're raising up kids who don't even know the Jewish language. Don't you think it's interesting that he talks about this? And they don't know the language. The kids are growing up, and they don't know the Jews' language. They speak the language of pagans. And when Nehemiah hears this, now remember the core values. Nehemiah gets on his horse, gets permission, and he heads back to Jerusalem to clean the house. It's kind of funny to me. I mean, this Tobiah thing. Tobiah, he was in power. He was heathen. He was an enemy inside the temple there. But he's a Trojan horse. And the high priest put him there. Incidentally, Sanballat's grandson is, let me get this right. No. Elisha's grandson is kin to Sanballat. There's intermarriage between them. And no wonder the high priest is doing this crazy stuff. He's connected to them. When Nehemiah gets back, he goes to the place where Tobiah is set up there at the temple. And the Bible doesn't say he went to him and said, your lease has expired and we need you to get your stuff out. The Bible says that Nehemiah threw his stuff out. There's strength in that. That's about convictions. That's about leadership. Sometimes you have to stand on your hind legs and say, we're not going to do this anymore. This is the end, and here's where the line is drawn, and I'm not going to let this happen. And that's what Nehemiah did. The last line in Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah. Let me see if I can make this work. There we go. Here's how it ends with this prayer. I think it's precious. Remember me, O my God, for good. You live your life like Nehemiah. And when you're called upon in some way, maybe some of you are right now in some leadership capacity in your life. If you're a daddy, if you're a patriarch of the family, you've got leadership. Maybe you've got some leadership going on in some other part of your life. You hold on to your core values. You remember that you're a servant leader. You remember all these principles of Nehemiah that we've talked about tonight. You be that. And then when you finish your life, pray like him. Remember me, oh my God, for good. Thank you for your kind attention. I hope that you now, with this working knowledge, if you didn't already have it, a working knowledge of the book of Nehemiah, will love him as much as I do. I think he's a remarkable, remarkable leader. God bless you.